All right, there we go. So hey, everyone, this is Sustainable Red Bank. This is a monthly program that we've been doing for over a year now. It's done with the Red Bank Public Library and with the Red Bank Environmental Commission. Just to give a few announcements at the library, we actually just reopened by appointment for browsing and a computer. If you want to come in and check a book out, feel free. Also, we still have curbside services open if anyone wants to check anything out. We are still doing all of our programs virtually, and we will be doing that at least through the end of the year until it's safe to, open back up. With this program, if you haven't attended it before, we try and do sustainability topics with a local focus. We've done a lot of really cool ones. We did like Gardens for Wildlife. We've done a recycling one. We've done composting. Several of those are up on our YouTube page if you're interested in looking at them. We just did one last month, which was fall vegetables. It was really interesting, all local and kind of like how to grow them and stuff from a master gardener at Rutgers. This month, before I go into that, a few bits of news for the library. We actually just started accepting submissions for our seed library. This is going to be something which, starting probably next March, we're just going to give away free seeds. We're really focusing on local and food, but we're also trying to get some pollinator seeds in there so that people can start building their own gardens in the area. We're pretty excited about it. We haven't had much in the way of submissions yet, but we've only been doing it for a little bit. So if you've got any seeds lying around the house that aren't copyrighted or anything, feel free to donate them to us. We've got a little blue box right on the front porch of the library that you can drop them into in an envelope. We also have guidelines for kind of what we'd like people to submit on our website. Let's see, other than that, we actually just got an award. We were awarded the a Resilient Communities Hub, or a Climate Resilience Hub, by the American Library Association, which was really exciting. We get a small grant with that, and we're going to be doing some programming, and we're going to eventually show a movie as part of that. We get a small documentary library with it as well, but we're kind of looking into how we're going to use that, but it's very exciting. We're one of only 25 libraries in the country that got it, and most of them are not as small as we are, so we're very happy about that. So today's Sustainable Red Bank, the topic is actually one of the ones I've been really excited about because we've been talking. I talked to Blair like a few days before COVID really kicked off about this, because I kind of have like a personal interest in this. When my daughter was born, I got super freaked out about climate stuff, and I started asking friends. And of the people that were in my wedding party, half of them have chosen not to have kids, with a major part of that decision being climate change. And when you talk to young climate activists, people are really, really freaked out about just the size of this problem. And that's led rise to eco-anxiety, which is, it's very, very real, and people haven't necessarily figured out how to cope with it yet because it's just such a massive problem. And it's really, people are just now starting to see just how bad that is. So one of our meetings, one of our Sustainable Red Bank meetings back when we were still open and we were still seeing people, Blair came and she mentioned that she was facilitating this eco-anxiety group through Waterspirit, which is a nonprofit through, what's the church in Rumson?
Well, we're located at the First Presbyterian Church in Rumson, but we're actually a sponsored ministry of a Catholic group named the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. Okay.
So yeah, it's really lovely property over there if you ever get a chance. But well, probably can't go in there right now. But we went. She came and she mentioned that she's been doing this. I asked if I could sit in on a session, but I couldn't because it was just started off and it was a very small group. Hopefully someday when we can go outside again and be in the world, I will be able to go to one of those. But Blair has offered very generously to talk about some of what she's learned facilitating this eco-anxiety support group, and that's going to be our topic tonight. So Blair, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm really happy to be here tonight. You and I have had great conversations on this topic in the past, and I really respect all of these sustainability and community building efforts that the Red Bank Library does. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you on this call tonight. Before we really kick things off, I'm going to share my screen, and I just need one moment to do that.
Sorry, if I could just ask that everyone mutes while she's talking, that would be great.
Come on now. There we go. Okay, so to give you a broad outline of what we're going to be going over tonight, we'll start with some of the mental health impacts of climate change. We'll talk a little bit about eco-anxiety and this 10-step group that Waterspirit offers, and then I'll offer some general tips on dealing with eco-anxiety, which I hope will be useful to folks on this call. And before I get into that content, I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. At the Red Bank Library and in Rumson, where Waterspirit is located, we are in fact on occupied Lenni Lenape land. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the Lenape peoples past, present, and future here in Lenapehoking and throughout the diaspora. We offer our care and gratitude for Lenapehoking, as well as our commitment to establish right relations with these lands and waters. On Monday, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and if anybody feels moved to make a donation to Lenape peoples in honor of this day, one resource for doing so is the Lenape Center website listed here. Now, I assume that folks who are coming to a talk given by Sustainable Red Bank at the Red Bank Library are probably aware of many of the impacts of climate change. The summer of 2020 has made many of them particularly visible, such as through the wildfires in California and the multiple storms hitting the Gulf Coast. So I don't want to belabor this point too much. We know that climate change impacts are becoming increasingly direct in our lives, and not only indirect or influencing certain communities more than others. Well, the impacts continue to be disproportionate, but the fact is we're seeing it more and more and cannot turn away. And we're seeing the effects of climate migration throughout the world, but even within our own country now. One report called Mental Health and Our Changing Climate, put out in 2018, estimates that by 2050, we'll see 200 million people displaced due to climate change. So climate migration is only going to go up. Here in New Jersey, we're going to see the impacts very close to home. On the left-hand side, you see a map of what a 12-foot rise in sea level will look like. This was put up by a group named NJ Frames. And you can see how it affects our area. Area shaded in blue will be underwater either during major storm events with the next 100 years, or will be permanently underwater with this 12-foot rise. On the right, you can see a graphic of Superfund sites throughout New Jersey, which are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So we know that we have to face this reality of that we've set a chain of events into motion, which is going to have impacts. The question is now just by how much. Many authors are speaking about the 6th mass extinction event, which has already been kicked off. Or, perhaps with a decade of very focused action, we can meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We can keep global warming to under 1.5 degrees centigrade by that mark. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of room for action right now, but with the scope of everything that we're facing, sometimes we can become overwhelmed by what climate change is doing to us in our lives. And it's important to remember that the slowdown caused by especially the early days of lockdown in COVID has not reduced greenhouse gas emissions as much as we need. In May, we were registering only a 17% decrease in fossil fuel emissions, which is not enough to reach the levels that we need them to be at. And since lockdown has been relaxed throughout this country and other countries throughout the world have gone back to business as usual, the International Energy Agency estimates that we're going to see in total a near 8% global reduction in emissions by the end of 2020. Now, often we talk about the impacts of climate change on humans. We see the focus placed on physical impacts on our physical health, through rising temperatures, more extreme weather, sea level rise, and increasing weather events and carbon emissions, resulting in an increased incidence of asthma, increased incidence of different kinds of diseases, on environmental degradation, and also through storms, through water and food quality, etc. But less often talked about are some of the other impacts on our community health and our mental health. So in addition to both the gradual and acute physical impacts of climate change, when we consider what's going to be happening to us and to our world, we should also consider the impacts on our communities. As you see here in this graphic, those can include increased personal aggression, a disrupted sense of belonging, a loss of community cohesion, increased violence and crime, particularly in the wake of disastrous storms, and social instability. And on the mental health side, we've seen increases in depression, stress, and anxiety, strains on social relationships, complicated grief, increased substance abuse, increased incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, loss of personal identity, and increased sense of helplessness and fatalism. And this graphic comes out of that Mental Health and Our Changing Climate report put out by EcoAmerica in 2018. And let's remember once again that these impacts are disproportionate, the impacts being worse on communities that are already overburdened. To quote from that report, following Hurricane Sandy, lower income residents reported weak or absent social support networks and had the greatest percentages of severe mental distress and diagnosis of depression or anxiety after the hurricane. Furthermore, 35% of children living in a household that earns less than $20,000 annually experienced feelings of sadness, depression, fear, or nervousness following the hurricane. So when we're looking at these mental health impacts of climate change, many people, whether they have been directly impacted by, say, wildfires or hurricanes, kind of major weather event, or whether the impacts upon them have been more diffuse or indirect, we're seeing increased incidence of eco-anxiety in the US population. Eco-anxiety is defined by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom. It was also defined by Professor Glenn Albrecht as the generalized sense that the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse. When we talk about eco-anxiety, you may or may not see this exact term being referenced. There's a constellation of related feelings which are often talked about in conjunction. You may hear the term climate anxiety to refer specifically to climate change's impacts on our mental health. You may hear a term like eco-grief or eco-depression or eco-trauma, each of these adding their own nuance to the description of the experience that the individual is going through. You may even come across the term solastalgia. This was coined by Professor Glenn Albrecht. Solastalgia is the melancholy produced by the loss of a sense of place. This can be either through migration or through significant changes in the land that a person has been on for a long period of time. And psychiatrist Lisa Van Susteren talks about pre-traumatic stress disorder. She has described this pre-traumatic stress disorder as particularly afflicting Gen Z, younger millennials. These are people who are experiencing anticipatory traumatic stress due to the loss of an imagined future, which they perceive as a result of these massive ecological changes that we're witnessing in the world. When we use these terms like anxiety and depression and trauma, we may have an impulse to consider eco-anxiety to be a kind of disease or pathology, but I find it more useful to think about it in Britt Ray's terms, who's the author of a blog called Gen Dread. She calls eco-anxiety a moral emotion. In fact, a very rational and compassionate reaction to these changes that we're seeing in the world. When I hear eco-anxiety, I react to it in a way that echoes very similarly to this quote from Andrew Boyd, which I'm going to read now. He says, "Compassion hurts. When you feel connected to everything, you also feel responsible for everything, and you cannot turn away. Your destiny is bound with the destinies of others. You must either learn to carry the universe or be crushed by it. You must grow strong enough to love the world, yet empty enough to sit down at the same table with its worst horrors." Now, as we can see, even from this description that I've given here, even though my focus is on eco-anxiety, There's no shortage of feeling words that we might be able to use to describe what we feel when we think about climate change. So I'm going to invite us to do a little exercise right now. We're going to make our own climate change word clouds. If you have pen and paper handy, I suggest that you use it to write down some of these words, to write down some of these reflections from this exercise. If not, you can just make a mental list. But Professor Van Susteren and Colino, in their book, Emotional Inflammation, offer this exercise. Fill in the blank. When I hear climate change, I think X. And on the left-hand side, on the left-hand image, you see a word cloud, a list of words that came to mind when somebody went through this exercise. When I hear climate change, I feel optimistic, fearful, despondent, regretful, panicky, shame, disgust. You can see there's a whole array of emotions. And I'm going to ask us to do this now without judgment of what's coming out. Just try and get really granular. What are all the nuances of emotion I feel? So let's take 1 minute and do it now. When I think about climate change, I feel, and write down or think about what you feel. Take 5 more seconds to finish your last thought. Now take a moment to look back on your list, your word cloud, or the words that you thought about in your head, and see if there are any trends, anything interesting that came up during that exercise about how you react when you think about climate change. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about my story, about how I got involved in this field. About 3 years ago, I was at grad school getting a master's in religion and ecology, and I started seeing the term climate anxiety in different articles that I was reading. It would just come across my inbox. Climate anxiety in what I was reading was always framed as a young person's issue. It was usually within the context of an article interviewing young millennials or Gen Z who were deciding not to start families because they were afraid of what the future would hold for their children because of impending climate collapse. I realized that there was a name for these feelings that I had seen in my friends, that I had registered in myself at different points in time. And in my evaluation, there can be so much overlap in the kind of non-denominational spiritual work that can happen in building community and helping people do this kind of inner reflection, working on their feelings in a supportive group. So when I got hired as Executive Director of Waterspirit in July of 2019, I started looking around for some kind of non-denominational climate pastoral care that we could offer, something that would be able to address this issue, which was getting and increasing attention. That was being increasingly named, although it was something that I had seen in people I knew for a long time. When I came down here to the shore and started learning more about the history of my organization, Waterspirit, I started realizing that my staff was carrying around their own eco-grief in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. This was in my evaluation. Waterspirit was founded in 1998, and from 1998 to 2017, we were housed in a waterfront retreat center down in the Elberon section of Long Branch. It was a beautiful retreat center, oceanfront, where people would come to connect with the water and connect to the universe, to spirit. And the loss of that building was really palpable still on my staff. And the reason that that building was let go of was because of Hurricane Sandy. Though damage to the property was minimal, the damage that the property sustained led to an environmental impact report, which led to an analysis of how much the sea was going to rise over the years and the eventual decision to let that property go. But the loss rent stayed with my staff. And many people on my staff were still years later dealing with the fallout from Hurricane Sandy, dealing with confusion with contractors or mold in their houses. It was still there. Sandy was a presence. And so I thought, well, if we do this kind of climate anxiety care or eco-anxiety care, that might address a need I'm even seeing here in my organization. So Googling around, I found the Good Grief Network's 10-step group, 10-step method, which is a peer-to-peer support network. And I thought, this is perfect. This is something that anybody can apply, and will offer a useful path to move through these emotions and figure out how to build resilience. Let's see what I want to share before we move into the video. Right, so since that time, since September 2019, Waterspirit has run 4 different eco-anxiety groups. We've gone through the 10 steps 3 full times. We're currently in our 4th time. And I'm gonna walk through what the 10 different steps are. But before I get there, I wanna share a quick video with you from Reuters when they came in to interview some of the folks who were part of that first group. And it may take a second to load. Last time I tried this, there was an ad that popped up, but if you'll just bear with me, appreciate your patience. Go ahead and mute that ad for a moment.
I'm sad, and frustrated. And it takes a lot to get me this sad.
Judy Kramer is a member of a support group for a rising mental health issue in the United States known as EcoAnxiety. That's anxiety caused by climate change.
I'm willing to work hard, and I have been. And there are people all around who are inspiring, like Greta Thunberg. But I don't feel hopeful. So I came to this group because I have climate anxiety and climate grief.
Climate change, including more severe weather events, warmer temperatures, and rising sea levels, according to the American Psychiatric Association, is having harmful effects on mental health. Though the APA does not classify climate anxiety as a disorder. Still, some psychologists say there's a growing need for mental health care specific to climate change. Elizabeth Allred is a psychologist and psychoanalyst.
It's a huge problem. It's not like having a fear of going over bridges where you can just avoid going over the bridges. It can turn into some kind of anger and frustration that we don't recognize where it's coming from. But it's actually coming from this issue that's not being addressed adequately.
David Frett, a father of 2, says he suffers from eco-anxiety. He participates in the same support group as Judy and describes the challenges he faces daily.
So few people even recognize the problem. It's one thing to not understand what the future may yield with having solutions, but to not even acknowledge that there's a similar problem that you understand just puts you in this lonely spot of of trying to deal with it, and that's where the anxiety comes from.
Experts say activism may be one way to deal with anxiety. A great example, Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, who says she fell into despair at age 11 when she realized the gravity of climate change. Since then, she launched a global movement. One psychiatrist told Reuters, empowering action is the antidote to those horrific, overwhelming emotions.
All right. I do want to complicate the note on which that video ends, though. They end on I realize that it's a very short video, and they end on the note that action can be a solution to these emotions. But I think they arrive at that conclusion a little too quickly because I am familiar with the high rate of burnout that exists among many environmental activists. And furthermore, what I've seen through the times that we've offered this EcoAnxiety support group is that it doesn't matter what your current level of involvement in environmental activism is, you still need to do this internal work in order to create the habits that help sustain me for the long run. In fact, I had a number of preconceived notions about who would be interested in a group like this before we started it. I thought, because I had always heard about climate anxiety within the context of Gen Z and millennials, I thought that the people would come would be a much younger group. What I've seen in practice is that EcoAnxiety support groups have multi-generational appeal. Everybody's concerned about what's going to happen to this planet and what situation we're leaving for future generations. And I also had assumed ahead of time that it would be primarily for people who weren't very involved in environmental work or didn't have many people in their immediate circle with whom they could talk about these feelings. And what I've seen that it also has wide appeal. These are techniques. This is the kind of resilience building work, which is important for everyone. So this is the technique that we are using. The Good Grief Network's 10 Steps to Personal Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate. This appealed to us because it's loosely based on the Alcoholics Anonymous model. The group meets once a week over the course of 10 weeks for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Accompanying each step is a resource packet with useful articles and quotes and poems and books and videos to watch. So you kind of get out of this method what you put into it. And one thing that was appealing for us also is that this is a peer-to-peer support network. So our facilitators have gone through a facilitator training with the Good Grief Network, and we've now offered it a few times, but this is a methodology that could be applied by anybody, anywhere, by following these steps. You know, we're peers coming together to support each other, and there's a lot of important work that can happen in a peer-to-peer environment as well. To walk you through what the 10 steps are, we usually start with an informational meeting, which we call step 0, where we just get everybody oriented. In step 1, we really dive into things head on. We spend that step accepting the severity of the predicament. In step 2, we practice being with uncertainty, which is very, very difficult for me and for many people. So we have a number of strategies for getting comfortable with uncertainty and even seeing the potential of it. In step 3, we honor my mortality and the mortality of all. Bring out the tissues on that step, I will tell you. In step 4, we turn inward to do inner work. We have learned strategies for doing this kind of emotional self-evaluation, and which is supplemented with step 5, where we develop awareness of brain patterns and perception. In this step, we learn about how we're hardwired to have a negativity bias and a confirmation bias and so forth, or maybe hardwired, it's the wrong term for it, but we realize these usual pathways that our brains function even outside of our conscious control, so that by bringing them to our awareness, we're hopefully less susceptible to them. In step 6, we practice gratitude, witness beauty, and create meaning. Practicing gratitude and really savoring positive moments, joyful moments, seem like really simple things to do, to the point where I can almost feel silly in reminding people, oh, it's important to say thanks, it's important to give thanks and practice gratitude. But really, there's an increasing body of psychological studies showing the importance of these regular practices of savoring, of practicing radical acceptance, and of giving thanks. So we practice that and give that importance in that step. In step 7, we take breaks and rest. We remember that we are more than just our productivity, and learn to check in with ourselves outside of a system that can be instrumentalist and relentless at times. In step 8, we acknowledge that we're part of the problems and solutions. And then step 9, show up. And step 10, reinvest myself into meaningful efforts, are steps in which we gain greater clarity as to what's within my reach, where are the the points where I can be an effective actor in the world in a way that sustains me for the long haul. So of these 4 groups that Waterspirit, 3 that we've completed, and then 1 that's in progress right now. One of those was held entirely in person at the church in Rumson. One of them began at the church in Rumson and then moved to Zoom due to lockdown back in March. And since then we've run and completed 1 group entirely on Zoom, and we're currently doing a Zoom group as well. And we're happy to report this, that while we love the in-person interaction, these steps have been strengthening and useful in both formats. I'd like to take a moment to read a few testimonials from people who have gone through the 10 steps. The first one is from Carol from New Jersey. She says, I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to participate in the 10-step EcoAnxiety support group. Our group was intergenerational, and the opportunity to share our concerns in an open, authentic, and meaningful conversation meant a great deal. It truly was a privilege to spend 10 weeks with interesting people and talk about things that really matter. Linda from California says, I thoroughly enjoyed the Waterspirit 10-step EcoAnxiety group. I felt relaxed and was able to express many feelings I have regarding our current environmental crisis. The facilitator, Abby, provided a well-structured, safe environment and went above and beyond in providing resources each week. Although I work in the mental health field, I was looking for a place where I could relieve some of my own thoughts among friends. I found it in this group. Thank you, Abby and Waterspirit. I would do it again. And then Rachel from New Jersey says, eco-grief was the term I needed to see and say out loud, to recognize the deep and heavy emotions I have been experiencing for some time now. From my community leadership experiences, I know peer-to-peer support results in significant benefits for the individuals and the collective. This 10-step group helped me explore my own emotional fortitude in a calm, safe space with others, not alone. We didn't foresee the COVID-19 breakout in January 2019, but I am so beyond utterly grateful I was already connected to this team, my fellow participants, and the growing 10 Steps group resources. I look forward to participating again, and I encourage other community leaders and activists to check it out. I'm sharing these quotes with you not in the interest of making a commercial for Waterspirit. I wanted instead to give a texture to many people's reactions to this 10-step group and to give you a greater sense of the way that a peer-to-peer group like this can build strengthening community. Because when we look at general coping strategies for dealing with eco-anxiety and for dealing with climate change in general, strengthening communities on all levels is one of the best ways to do it. When we talk about community resiliency, it's important to look at infrastructure, to look at disaster response, to look at a number of resources, but also to include mental health and relationship building within the kind of community resilience that we're creating. Another important coping strategy is to cultivate a spiritual practice. This can be with a particular faith community, or this can also be an individual practice such as yoga or meditation. But cultivating a daily spiritual practice will help you cope with these feelings much more effectively. And I will say that Waterspirit, as an eco-spiritual nonprofit, even though these 10 steps are not tied to any particular spiritual tradition, I do see this work as the spiritual work, because from my point of view, there are 3 principal spiritual needs of human beings, and one is the need for meaning and purpose. So processing these emotions and these experiences in community can be a way of leading to reflections on them that generate meaning and purpose. A second spiritual need is the need for relationship and love, and coming together with supportive people is a way of building that kind of relationship and love, and cultivating that love and compassionate love for all human beings. And a third spiritual need is the need for reconciliation in community and hope. Now, one thing that comes out of the 10 steps, and which is an important coping strategy for eco-anxiety, is to practice critical hope. So the kind of hope I'm talking about is not a kind of spiritual bypassing. It isn't an empty optimism. It's more nuanced than that. So I'm going to borrow the words of Rebecca Solnit, author of Hope in the Dark, to describe what critical hope feels like. And I quote, "It's important to say what hope is not. It is not the belief that everything was, is, or will be fine. The evidence is all around of tremendous suffering and tremendous destruction. The hope I'm interested in is about broad perspectives with specific possibilities, ones that invite or demand that we act. It's also not a sunny, everything is getting better narrative, though it may be a counter to the everything is getting worse narrative. You could call it an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings. Critical thinking without hope is cynicism, but hope without critical thinking is naivete," the Bulgarian writer Maria Popova recently remarked. And Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, early on described the movement's mission as to provide hope and inspiration for collective action, to build collective power, to achieve collective transformation, rooted in grief and rage, but pointed toward vision and dreams. It's a statement that acknowledges that grief and hope can coexist. That's one of my big takeaways from this group as well. Grief and hope can coexist. Other coping strategies, it's important to regulate your exposure to your known triggers. The state of the world right now is likely going to lead to enough anxiety about what's happening, what's going to happen. So if you know, for example, that doom scrolling on Twitter is one of your big triggers, then perhaps create a self-discipline of checking the news once in the morning and then not referring back to it until the same time the next day, and maybe take an entire day with a Twitter break or so forth. But understanding what triggers these feelings in you and then regulating your exposure to them is an important method for coping. And then, as we mentioned, as we went through the steps, gratitude and choosing what you're going to pay attention to is very, very powerful and simple, as is really taking the time to savor the pleasurable moments, the joyful moments, that which gives texture and meaning to life. And that helps overcome our negativity bias as well. As we cope with these feelings and move into action, it's important for the long run to remember that change takes many forms. In our society, we have a tendency to really uplift celebrity activists or one image of what effective change looks like. Whereas social change, I like to think of with the metaphor of the mushroom, which is why you see it pictured here. What's a mushroom but a network, a mycelial network that's interconnected under the ground? And the mushroom that we see above the ground is just the fruiting body. So through community building, through these little acts of resilience that we do in the day-to-day, we're building up that underground network that's ready to blossom into the mushroom of major change here, the major change there, as the conditions become right. Interestingly, we are also seeing that studies have also shown that people who feel positive about their ability to overcome a source of stress and trauma do better than people with lower self-efficacy. So, in other words, the more you believe in your own efficacy, the more you believe that you can make a change, you actually become more able to make a change. So, creating a new image for ourselves of what social change looks like, what effective action is, and by bringing it into what's really within our immediate sphere of influence and focusing on the small is one of the best ways to not only see the results of your action, but to believe that you are capable of taking action. There's a great quote that I'd like to share from Clarissa Pinkola Estes. She says, "Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach." And I've really taken that for myself and see that as a good coping mechanism for eco-anxiety and for taking action that sustains us in the long run. Another important thing to do as we're taking action is to create new stories for ourselves. Let us not suffer from a lack of the imagination. Let's counter our certainty of all the horrible things that could come in the future with a new image, new models of the world that we could create and the world that we want to create. And remember to take action rooted in that place of excitement of the new world that we're bringing into being. And on a final note for taking action, at the end of the day, it's important to do the work that is right because it is right to do it. The more we can detach ourselves from seeing the outcomes, the more we'll be able to root right here in the present moment and do things without necessarily being attached to what's coming next. Or in the words of Václav Havel, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. A couple of additional steps that might be useful for people working in particular fields. For mental health professionals, I suggest that you become eco-literate through connecting with the Climate Psychiatry Alliance or the Climate Psychology Alliance, which offer great resources. Or if there are mental health professionals in your lives, perhaps recommending that they gain the tools to be able to talk about eco-anxiety and eco-depression, eco-grief, etc., with clients that may be coming in to see them. For policymakers, implement climate change solutions. The more green strategies that you implement, the greater the positive impact on your constituents. It turns out that by encouraging physical commuting, public transportation, creating green spaces, and implementing clean energy, you're not only cleaning the planet and making our physical health better, but also our mental health. And for those who are not policymakers, but who have the ability to influence policymakers, hint, hint, wink, wink, everybody on this call, you can also encourage them to continue to implement these sustainability solutions. I'd like to leave you with a few more additional resources. So in addition to the Good Grief Network's 10 Steps program, which I've talked about at length, a really great book came out this year called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. This was written by Humboldt University professor Sarah Jaquette Ray. It was written based on her interactions with her students, who are mostly Gen Z and perhaps I think younger millennials as well. So the book is written as a guide directed at young people. However, I've found its tips to be useful across generations. It's been in Waterspirit's book club. We've had great conversations about the tips she offers as well. So I recommend that one. Britt Ray runs a blog called Gen Dread, which has some great resources as well. If you're looking for an eco-literate mental health professional, the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and Climate Psychology Alliance are good places to look. And you can also sign up for Waterspirit's weekly newsletters where we talk about our upcoming events as well. For those who are looking for a community to take action with, we have recently started a rapid response team, which you can always sign up for to take action in your community. We also offer moments of community building and reflection through weekly meditation for Earth, all happening online right now, and seasonal rituals on the solstices and equinoxes, and other kinds of eco-spiritual educational opportunities throughout the year. Before we move into question and answer, I would like us to take just a few minutes to engage in a visualization exercise, which I would also like to offer as one more tool in your tool chest if you're feeling something that might feel big or overwhelming when you think about what's going to happen to this planet. So at this moment, I'd like everybody to get comfortable in your chair, close your eyes, and focus on your breath. Just feel what the air feels like as it passes right through your nostrils, right at the base of your nose. What does it feel like when the air is coming in and out? With your eyes still closed, imagine your spine stretching down. The base of your spine stretches down to the center of the earth, but spreads out like the roots of a tree. Root deep, deep down in the earth. And then above the top of your spine, On top of your head, visualize a cloud of light, like a diffuse canopy of a forest filled with bright light. As you breathe in, feel that bright healing light entering you through the branches, coming down through your body, through your heart. And as you breathe out love and peace and send that down to the earth. Breathe in that healing light. Breathe out the love and the peace for the earth. Breathe in the healing light. And breathe out the love and peace. Continue for a few minutes. As we heal the earth heals us in turn. Come back to your breathing. And when you are ready, please open your eyes. Thank you, everyone. This is my contact information up on the screen. I'd love to continue this conversation, so please reach out after this talk if you'd like to do so. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen so we can have some time to chat.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute for that, or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out. One thing I wanted to add was that you mentioned a few times the Hope in the Dark book. That's been like kind of a go-to handout to people when I feel like when I talk about this, because Rebecca Solnit in particular is really great with that. She also had a book called A Paradise Built in Hell, which is about kind of disasters and kind of the communities that arise in disasters. And it's really, really interesting because it's not as pessimistic and bleak as a lot of pop culture would make you think that these kind of disaster situations really are. But anything she's written is really good for this type of thing.
Excellent recommendations. I hadn't read the Paradise book. I'll have to track that down.
Yeah, she goes through a bunch of different, they're called disaster utopias. And it turns out that when there's like a major event, it turns out people are much better at kind of self-organizing and taking care of each other than they're given credit for. She's found that so she went through September 11th, she went through Katrina, she went through like the San Francisco fire of 1905. And she kind of goes through all these like major catastrophes and talks about how when those things happen, people are actually very, very good at solving problems and kind of, banding together. And one of the big things that they found was that actually most of the lives that are saved in these disasters aren't first responders, but they're the people that are there on the scene. So like even in September 11th, like there were a bunch of people up in the buildings there was a guy in a wheelchair and they like carried him down the stairs, which if the firefighters had to go up and get him, then all of them would have died. And so like, it's kind of these type of things where people actually are very good at doing this on their own. And it's not just, when that stuff collapses, it's not just all chaos and everything. It's really an interesting book for if you feel particularly bleak about stuff like hurricanes or like, and if you were actually, I wasn't here when Sandy hit, but I was here a couple days afterwards, and I kind of saw the same thing where I really did see people just going over to their neighbors' houses and helping them clean stuff out and kind of, so, it's that old Mr. Rogers look for the helpers thing. You really do see a lot of that, but that's a good one to read if you feel a lot of despair about it.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's so wonderful to have those narratives of what humans are capable of doing under pressure and through communal work. That's really beautiful. And hopefully we can inspire ourselves in those examples to be, even better at it in the future, even more ready to respond.
If there are any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop recording in case that's something that if people don't want to have their questions recorded. But I'm going to go ahead and stop that right now. Let's see.